Public Lecture. We're really excited to be offering this to the people who are ordinarily here on a Sunday from Southern Cross Community Church, but also to the wider community. And we're very excited to be offering topics like mental health, environment this morning. Next month you'll see a little promo later, and that is someone who has lived for 15 years in Bangkok, has amazing stories to tell about fast fashion and how to avoid it. There will be a whole range of different topics we'll be covering in these next few months. So it'll be the fourth Sunday of every month, 10:30 here. So you obviously got the memo, so lovely to see you. And I would like to just acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and we pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And we want to acknowledge the significant impact the Wurundjeri people have had on this Nillumbik area, treading lightly on these lands, and that's something we would like to emulate, and that's probably why we're all here this morning. So you will have seen the colouring table at the back. So far it's under 16s up there, but there's no reason why it can't be over 16s. Please help yourself if you can nudge a bit of room. The toilets, if you need them, just out the doors, women's on the left and men's on the right. And live streaming is available, so this live stream will be available obviously now, but you're here. It will be available for the next month, so you can ask us afterwards where to find that, but you can find it on the Southern Cross Community Church website, so feel free to do that. Now, Philip is going to be introduced, but you don't want an arts major doing that. You want someone who knows something about science. So fortunately, we have plenty of those at Southern, and Kate is going to be introducing Philip now.
Good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce Phil to you this morning. Professor Philip Badham, whose excellent work I've been aware of since late 1990s, feels like a long time ago now, when I was a postgraduate student at the University of Melbourne in the School of Botany. So Philip commenced his formal science education at La Trobe University with a Bachelor of Science with honours in genetics, followed by a PhD in genetics at Monash University. Following 2 years of postdoc research at Syracuse University in New York State, he joined the University of Melbourne as a research fellow before being appointed as a lecturer of genetics. As well as running a research lab during his time at the Uni of Melbourne, Phil served as an Associate Dean in Science in Communications and Development and Provost Fellow of Student Experience, and was recognised as an Emeritus Professor in 2020. Philip has been recognised at the national level for his research, teaching and science communication. The Genetics Society of Australasia awarded him the MJD White Medal for Research Excellence in Genetics. He was awarded the Carrick Citation for his exceptional record in the supervision, support and career mentoring of his research higher degree students. He's also been a 5-time finalist in the Eureka Prize for Public Communication of Science. Phil's organised major international conferences, including International Congress of Genetics, a UN conference on global health, and 5 times has co-organised Genetics Society of Australasia's national conference. He's a former president of the International Genetics Federation and is currently serving as secretary. And his research is still going strong. Phil currently heads a research group at the Bio21 Molecular Science and Biotechnology Institute at Melbourne University, which includes supervision of postgraduate students, quite a number, I believe. His research team studies the interaction of chemical insecticides with pest and beneficial insects, with the goal of understanding insect biology well enough to develop healthier and more environmentally friendly pest control solutions. What an amazing life and love of science. Please join me in welcoming Phil up the front. So Phil, well done. What a great track record. But as we tell all our Year 12 VCE students, you are more than your ATAR score. So I was wondering if I could ask you just a couple of quick questions so we can find out a little bit more about the person behind the science.
Before you do, you've just triggered something. I failed Year 12.
Right. That answers my first question. Is can you tell us a fun fact about yourself or a hobby? But yeah.
Well, I'll give you the hobby, but the fun fact is I grew up in Reservoir. I was in a school that was not particularly good. Like in Year 10, we didn't have a maths teacher, but they passed us all on to do Years 11 and 12, signing us up for what would have been the equivalent of maths methods and specialist maths, and didn't fare well. So got a compensated pass, offered a place at La Trobe University, went to enrol, and the person doing the enrolment, an associate professor, that said, surely we don't have to take people like you. And he calls VTAC equivalent, and I heard them say, you have to take him. So that was the beginning of my academic journey.
Yeah, right. Oh.
But as for the second
Perseverance,
question, hobbies, something that was really influential in my life is when I was young, I remember my mother taking me to this old theatre, the Tivoli Theatre in Burke Street, and we'd see a pantomime every now and again. And going to the theatre was just a transformational experience for me. And when I got into high school, I started to do school shows, and after leaving, helped form a theatre company and took on every role. I took on lots of roles on stage until they found people much better than me. But got involved in both the management of the theatre company, but also on the production side. And for me, this was something that was just magical. So you would try and recruit people, performers, directors, scenic designers, lighting designers. You try to bring together this team, and sometimes magic would happen. You know, this chemistry would produce something that was really, truly beyond your wildest dreams. And to me, even talking about it, it kind of gives me tingles, because it's just such an important part of my life. And as a scientist, that's prompted me to get involved in running major conferences, and I've emphasised those being something of an experience, not just a meeting, something that would be unforgettable for people involved.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a second question is, can you tell us a little bit about how your values are reflected in your work?
Well, I'm a Jesus follower, and there's one precept that he gave us. He just said, love everybody. And so I try to carry that into my work. But also that theatrical production thing, bringing together a team of people, really bringing them together, trying to unify them so that they support each other, but they, using modern language, can be the best version of themselves so that they can establish their personal best. And as my mentor in science said, at the end of it, there being glory enough for all. We share the joy when we succeed. So that's been really important. So I see my lab as my family. And we've really developed a fantastic tone. I mean, sometimes, like any other family, things go wrong, and somebody really causes a perturbation in the lab family. But by and large, I've watched them love each other tangibly in the way in which they treat each other. So to me, that's wonderful, and it's made my career very satisfying.
Well, thank you very much. That's all from me. So, over to you.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure for me to be invited here. I understand that Kate heard me give a talk to an organisation called ISCAST, and that talk was on Zoom, and it was comically bad at once. At one point in time, I hit something on Zoom, and suddenly my words were being translated poorly into text, and I couldn't control it. So hopefully I've got more control this morning, and that kind of thing is not going to happen. So I've been invited to speak to you on this topic, and on the first part, insects and biodiversity, I can claim some authority there. The second part may be more an audience participation game, but I think some of the things that we need to do are pretty basic, but basic things can be really important. So I want to start by pointing out something that may not be obvious, but is absolutely true, is that all life exists in ecosystems, and some of them are really beautiful, like the marine ecosystem on that slide. And within those ecosystems, there is interdependence, an interdependence of different life forms on each other. There is a reliance. And living in an ecosystem, organisms, plants, animals, fungi, and so on, they can adapt to change. And that's really an interaction between the organism, its genome, and the environment. But that adaptation process takes time. It occurs slowly. So the other thing I want to say is that all organisms on life, everything from viruses to us, are related. And the image here shows DNA molecule in the background. It's because of that coding material, and in fact the similarity in the coding material between us and organisms, that establishes a degree of relationship between us and all life forms on Earth. Now the fly there, it's called Drosophila, which basically means rubbish lover. It's found everywhere on planet Earth, and in fact it's been into space, sent courtesy of NASA. And since the early 20th century, it's been a really important plaything for geneticists. And so much about what we know about your genetics and my genetics actually comes from this fly. Basic things like what genes are, that they are on chromosomes, that they can be mutated or changed, that there is a chromosome that determines sex. All of these things discovered in flies, and Nobel Prizes were awarded for it. But Nobel Prizes in medicine were also awarded for things like how development occurs, how you go from being a fertilized egg to being a fully formed human. Most of the genes for that process, the key genes, were discovered in that fly, and 2 people got a Nobel Prize for it. Someone got a Nobel Prize for developing an understanding of how some parts of the immune system work. And 3 other guys got a Nobel Prize for understanding how the genome can impact behaviour. These things are pretty personal to us, how we develop, how our brain works, how our immune system works. We think them distinctly human, but discoveries in that fly have transformed our knowledge. Now, I've been doing something rather unique. I've been using this fly to, in fact, model organisms that are much closer, and that is insects. Now, getting back to the ecosystem theme, our survival as humans depends upon ecosystem health. And humans have inhabited this earth so fully that we are really impacting every ecosystem on Earth, and it's not going well. And we only need to read the newspapers and jump online and watch television to know that it is not going well. Now, in years gone by, miners used to go down into mines equipped with breathing gear, as you can see the guys on the left, and they would go in with a little canary in a cage. And the purpose of the canary was to monitor the environment, and in particular whether there were toxic gases in the environment. And if the canary keeled over, that was a signal for the miners to get out. And you may not be interested in insects, but what I want to tell you this morning is that insects, I think, are the canary in the mine for us as humans in allowing us to understand and identify the things that we are doing in the environment that are dangerous to ecosystems and to us. So why are insects good canaries? Well, there's many reasons, but I want to talk about 2. And one is this energy pyramid or food chain. So at the bottom of the pyramid, in fact, the pyramid sits on soil and it's surrounded by air, and clearly it sits in an environment where there is a particular temperature. But down at the bottom of the pyramid, you've got plant matter, and then just above that, you've got insects. And the insects, they consume plants, they can also feed on animals, but they feed on plant matter, and then animals up the chain, we'll call them secondary consumers, it might be little rodents. They are feeding on the insects, and they're being fed on by top-line predators, like eagles and hawks and so on. And of course, we're at the top of that pyramid. So insects occupy a pivotal position in that food chain. And we'll come back to why that ends up being significant in a moment. But they're also very dependent upon the soil, the water, and the climate. And I just want to talk about climate briefly, because there's some things about insects that are not self-obvious. First of all, insects are what we would call cold-blooded. Their internal body temperature is the external temperature. And every biological function within the insect, whether it's metabolism or movement or reproduction, everything is dependent upon the external temperature. And a given species has a particular temperature range over which it can function. There are really tight boundaries at which a particular insect is going to be functional. So, for example, that fly Drosophila stops reproducing when temperatures get below about 15 degrees Celsius. And it probably can survive up until temperatures are over 37 degrees, but that will depend upon humidity. And really importantly, males become infertile at much lower temperatures than that. So in my fly, males become infertile at 29 degrees. Now think about that. There's quite a lot of days that are way above 29 degrees, and so they're impacting the reproduction of this species. And the more days we have over 29 degrees, the more impacted the species will be. And it actually turns out to be true that in almost all insects, male infertility kicks in at much lower temperatures than the maximum temperature at which a species can survive. And so climate change can lead to changes in range and abundance of insects. That's why people talk about things like the mosquitoes that vector dengue fever, for example, may move further south with time because the environment becomes more favourable to them. There'd be other places in the world where insects would begin to disappear. And insects are beginning to disappear. And in fact, there's been longitudinal studies that are suggesting that insect populations are declining at a rate of about 1% per annum. Talking about terrestrial insects, dropping by 1% per annum. So why is that going to be significant to us? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and there are a list of attributes here that insects bring, services that they deliver. One of them is pollination. And everybody's favourite insect is the honeybee. It's just one of many pollinating species, and we rely heavily on pollination services. I refer there to Two World Clocks. There is in fact a site on the web where you can look. It's called Two World Clocks. And it shows population increase in the world, and you can just watch the clock ramping up, and it shows the amount of arable land available for agriculture, declining. So the ratio of humans to food-producing land is increasing, by the minute. Pest control. Insects can be very useful in controlling other insects. Nutrient recycling, well, we know about species that decompose. Sometimes we don't like that because there'll be blowflies and they stink, but out in the natural environment, that decomposition process is really important. And I've already highlighted really this critical one of food resources in ecosystems being near the bottom of the pyramid, and increasingly food sources for humans, and the list goes on and on. So insects are really important. There's 5.5 million species on planet Earth, and some of them will disappear before we even know what they contribute to this list. So what happens if you damage the base of a pyramid? Well, the pyramid collapses. And there are signs that that's happening. So this is just one piece of data, and it shows that over a period of approximately 50 years in the United States, that 30% of the bird population has disappeared. 2.9 billion birds less than there were in 1970, and that is linked to insect decline because these birds that are disappearing feed on insects. And I use this analogy of Jenga, the tower of blocks. How do you most quickly, if you want to lose, I hate games, hate playing games, Chris will tell you that, hate playing games, but if I wanted to lose, so if I want to lose a game of Jenga quickly, how would I do it? I'd start tugging blocks from the bottom and the tower would fall. Well, we're playing an ugly game of Jenga. Now, there is a focus on climate change in this world, and there's good reason for it. Someone recently used the term canary in the mine in a different context and said climate change is the loudest canary in the mine, meaning that there's a lot of other factors that are impacting insects. So climate change is one, the intensity of storms, fires, nitrification of soil, pollution, urbanisation. There's a colleague at work that's done work on what city lights do to insects, and it's huge. Introduced species, the intensification of agriculture, land clearing, and insecticides. Now, I put a note here, 1 + 1 = 11, to remind me to say something to you, and that is that these factors don't necessarily act independently on an insect, on any organism. The impact can be synergistic, multiplicative, and so you take any two of these factors together and they may have a multiplicative effect. And in fact, in my work, I believe that work that we're doing on insecticides suggests that there could be a synergistic interaction between insecticide exposure and climate change, because the insecticides, as I'll show you, make the organism more vulnerable to other factors. Okay, so a little bit about insecticides. There are costs and benefits. When people hear me speak, they just want to say, let's ban insecticides. But if we did that today, then we really couldn't feed the world. But we're using tons, like hundreds of thousands of metric tons per year of these insecticides that are designed to work at minute concentrations. So it's a lot of chemical. They are not pest specific. There are no pest specific insecticides because there is not enough profit for chemical companies if they design something that will only kill one pest. And because, as I've pointed out, insects, if an insect is closely related to us, it's even more closely related to other insects. And so insecticides will not only impact pests, but they'll impact beneficial insects as well. So insecticides are applied to crops in various ways, and they're applied at a concentration that will mean that an insect that's exposed will just drop dead. A bit like you hunting with a can of Mortein. Insect dies quickly, and that's what you want, and that's what farmers want. But if, for example, you're spraying an insecticide, then the spray spreads and the concentration is diluted, and beneficial insects that are not the target will be exposed to a lower concentration that will not kill them, but it doesn't mean that it does nothing, and that will be the point of what I'm going to show you in a minute. But back to the two world clocks, population is increasing, global population increasing by 220,000 people per day. 33,000 hectares of arable land, useful land for agriculture, is being lost per day. So that ratio is really bad, and insecticides increase crop yield often dramatically, and in developing nations sometimes it means the difference between having a crop and not having anything at all. And that's an issue. So there are insecticides that have been intensively studied, and one of them that I've studied is called Imidacloprid, and it's been banned in Europe for agricultural use because of its impact on honeybees. In Europe, not in Australia, but in Europe, honeybee colonies are collapsing, and this insecticide, Imidacloprid, it's a nicotine-resembling compound, is being suggested as being one of the culprits. Not the only culprit, but one of the culprits. By the way, nicotine was the first insecticide probably ever used. It's a plant compound which is a defense compound against insects. So I want to talk to you a bit about two insecticides. One I'm calling Darth Vader, and it's Imidacloprid, the insecticide I've just mentioned. Considered to be evil. You can't buy it in a Bunnings store because people here have protested knowing what the European data says. The other is Luke Skywalker, the good guy. An organic insecticide discovered in a rum distillery in the West Indies once, produced by a soil bacterium, now produced in massive amounts in vats in the United States and other places. Now our work has gone on for a number of years, and what we study are these low doses that do not kill, and we're asking what do they do to the insect. So here's my favourite fly. We expose it to these low doses of insects. ppm stands for parts per million. Don't worry too much about this. But here we're looking at energy levels, and we're looking at it in two ways. We're comparing the flies that are not exposed to the insecticide and those that are, in both of these cases. And here we're looking at an enzyme that's important in producing a chemical form of energy called ATP. And in 2 hours of exposure to Imidacloprid, energy levels drop by about 25% as measured by this enzyme, and about 20% as measured by the chemical form of energy called ATP. That's a very significant drop to a low dose, caused by a low dose in a very short period of time. So reduced energy is a factor. We began to look at what was happening in the brain because these insecticides target the brain. And we looked at vision loss because we could. There's a bit much light here, but there's a fly on the stage here, and it's got two electrical probes inserted into it, one into the eye and one into the back of the head. And that allows us to look at what happens when there is a flash of light. Now this is quite a complex trace, but I want you to just look at this part of the trace, because this little spike here, the light has gone on, and that's the light response of the insect. It stimulates the nervous system and you get this spike. Over here with Imidacloprid, that spike is reduced to next to nothing, suggesting that the fly is blind. We can look at the eye at a much deeper level, and the eye of a fly is an amazing thing. So there are several hundred eyes on each side of the head, and they form a compound eye. So here we're looking at an individual eye, and this is a graphic of what that looks like. Got these little structures here that actually trap light, and this structure is surrounded by pigment cells that optically insulate so that light doesn't bounce around between the lights. It's an amazing story. But you delve down into the bottom of that structure. We've cut sections. We're looking under an electron microscope. And here's the structure that I showed you, these light-trapping organs. And so this is the normal, not exposed to imidacloprid. And here is one that's been exposed to imidacloprid. And what we find is that there are all these cells around the outside of this individual eye that are dead. And they are the cells that nourish these photoreceptor, these light-receiving cells in the middle. And this is why the fly is blind. So if you then look at the head of the fly and you look through, you do a cross-section, and we've taken these cross-sections. So this is the cross-section of a fly, and it could be a fly that has been exposed to imidacloprid, but it doesn't look any different to a fly that has not been exposed to any insecticide at all, because at this level, here's the eyes, here's the lobes of the brain which control sight, and then there's this central region, and this all looks pretty normal in flies that are exposed to imidacloprid. But flies are exposed to spinosad, the organic insecticide, at a dose that's 100 times lower. This central brain region is just full of holes, it would appear. That's where massive numbers of cells have died. So the organic is at least 100 times worse. So actually, the slides are redundant there, but I wanted to just show you this. This region of the brain that is missing are regions that are known to be important for things as basic as learning, memory, olfaction, and a range of other things that we probably don't even know yet. That insecticide is classed as organic for no other reason than the fact that it was discovered in a rum distillery in the West Indies once. And so my conclusion is that both of these are Darth Vader. They're both pretty bad. And the organic is even worse because everything that we see with imidacloprid we see as worse with spinosad. And we actually believe that this is a graphic of all of the different classes of insecticides in the world. We believe that most of them fundamentally do the same thing. They cause this so-called oxidative stress in mitochondria. They're the structures that are the energy centers of cells, and they disrupt mitochondrial function. It becomes dysfunctional, doesn't produce energy, but also these reactive oxygen species, these oxidants, do damage elsewhere in the organism. So what might these and other insecticides do to insects in the field? Well, the energy loss is going to impact high energy processes, flight and reproduction. It's going to shorten lifespan, and in my fly that would not be such a problem. They live for quite a long time and they do most of their reproduction early. But bees are social creatures, and worker bees go through a range of occupations in the hive as they get older. And so the whole colony structure, the whole communal structure could be disrupted by the shortening of lifespan. Neurodegeneration will affect a range of behaviours, not just vision. The loss of vision is important because they would be unable to find food resources. We discovered that there's reductions in immunity, and so they will be more susceptible to microbial infection. And that factor, when I talked about 1 + 1 = 11, a loss of resilience in the face of other stresses. So there are a lot of things that we as humans are doing in the environment, and very little of it is good. And the time for action was actually quite a long time ago, but as people have been saying recently in the context of the pandemic, the best time is now. So we need to be acting. I recently saw a wonderful film called Don't Look Up. And I really urge you, if you are interested in environmental issues, to see it. It's something of a parody, and it looks not at environmental change, but a meteor headed towards Earth, and this battle between people who are looking up and knowing it's coming, and those that are saying, don't look up. We are in a time where we should not be looking up, but looking around and reading the tea leaves. So in the title of the talk, it talks about our backyard. Well, our backyard is maybe that, or maybe it's Australia, but I've told you that all things are connected, and really all three of these represent our backyard because of the connectedness of life on this planet. And there are things that you can do, and I'm probably speaking to the converted here this morning, because many of you are probably doing these things. Simple things count. We feel powerless at times, but we can't sit and do nothing. So, planting. Chris and I bought a block of land that was just a wasteland on the edge of the Plenty River Gorge, and we planted plants, and there are birds coming, and there are insects there are moths, and we see things. It does make a difference. You're providing a home, you're providing nutrition, you're providing a habitat. Composting, not using excessive power, saving water, recycling and reusing. There's a work in the church that Chris and I go to where clothes for babies and children are cleaned up and sent out to people that need them in the community. That's an environmental thing as well as a good thing to do in acting kindly towards others. Reducing our use of cars by walking or cycling or finding some other means. Using public transport rather than cars. Not using too much paper. There's lots of little things, and we know what they are, and we need to do them. We also need to use the best technological solutions available. Something I just want to scream when I hear politicians talking about future technologies when they don't want to use the technologies that scientists have already come up with. And it's just really vital that we use what we've got at this point in time. We can't wait for new technologies to come online when there are some good ones that are present. And the other thing is advocacy. We do need to use our voice, we do need to use our vote, we do need to try and create influence, positive influence, in bringing the change that we need. So I think I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you've got. In fact, I'd be delighted to do so.
Thank you very much. Please join me in quickly thanking Phil. And I'll help crowd control with any questions. Put your hand up. Yes, at the back there.
I consider myself an organic grower, so I don't really use sprays or insecticides, but what I've been using is insect traps. Trying to catch mainly fruit fly, but I find catching lots of things such as blowflies and other kinds of flies. Now is that actually doing more harm than good by taking out all those flies from the environment? So what are you catching the flies, what are you catching the insects for? Right. Well, I'd say that's sort of you need to probably prevent the fruit fly, so you've got to do something, and that's probably less of a threat than some other things that you could be doing. There is research on the sense of smell in insect pests. In fact, I've got a research grant in that area, And what we would like to be able to do is to produce traps that were specific to insect pests. And that would make your traps more effective.
Yeah, the problem with fruit fly is I've got a male-specific trap.
Yep.
Which has got a scent that is pretty much attractive, mainly just for male fruit flies.
Yep.
But they're not the big problems.
No, they're not.
There's no good female-specific.
Yeah. I mean, so in most, well, certainly most flies, a female can lay hundreds of eggs. And in some cases, like the sheep blowfly that we've done some work on, they do it in a big hurry. There's just this mass of eggs that are deposited. And so dealing with males is not contributing a huge amount.
Any other questions?
Sally? So we know of 2 dark vader insecticides. Are there any good options, or are there any good options being developed?
Been asked this question by journalists a bit lately. The spinosad work was published in a big journal last week, and so I did an interview. The reality is that the sort of work that we've done, and I've just really shown you the tip of the iceberg, goes to a depth that no other research has ever gone, because people, and actually like myself in the past, would study what these things did to pests. And really, the average person doesn't care much about how they kill pests. They just want them dead. And farmers are the same. And chemical companies were the same too, because regulators weren't requiring them to get the kind of information about what they might be doing at low dose. So because we were interested in the question, because we had the technological capability given to us really by the sophistication of the work that can be done in that fly, we've gone much further. And so the sample size of insecticides that have been studied in depth is 2, the 2 I've mentioned. I've got a couple of master's students that are working on a couple of other insecticides. We've got some diagnostics that we can put over them, but I'd have to say I've not been able to get any research funding for this work. I've got 2 papers in outstanding international journals, and not $1 of money has been available, and I really can't figure it other than the fact that there's a great shortage of research funding in Australia, so it's just incredibly competitive. So I suspect there's been some research done on other insecticides that would suggest that the pattern that we're seeing will be the same. But at the moment, we can't be prescriptive about what's the best. People were reaching to spinosad instead of some of these other insecticides because it was organic. And that's just, you can't say that something's safe simply because it was discovered in the environment. Cyanide was discovered in the environment. It's just ridiculous. There was a question over here, I think. Yes.
One of your diagrams had all the threats.
Yes.
In a circle. Humanity is only adept at, yes, that one. Is only adept at concentrating in war terms on 1 or 2 things at a time. It sounds like to me all of those need to be concentrated on at the same time. What is the solution here?
Well, there's no great solution because, I have trouble walking and chewing gum at the same time, and I'm not atypical. So one of the things that, just a little bit of encouragement for you, when people think about climate change, they are thinking about things like agricultural intensification, land clearing, and so on. So this is causing people to think about some of these other things because they are causal. Things here are not, they're not interrelated. We could draw lines between them and say, and you'd have a big, a network of crosses on that page. So I think because people are actually experiencing climate change, then it does lead them to look at these other factors. And it does change the way people do things. So people do map public sentiment and when different things happen in the environment. So for example, a decade or so ago, there was a massive drought in Australia, and that really changed people's views on how food should be produced. So for example, genetically modified crops, people had been dead set against them, and then when it looked like there could be food shortage, people are saying, well, maybe we should try that. It's a bit like, I use the analogy, if I have a cold and go to the doctor and they suggest some experimental treatment, I'm likely to say no. If I've got cancer and I go to the doctor, I'll say, I'm your guinea pig. So, you know, when things get desperate, it changes the way we think. And we need it to change the way we think at this point in time. Yes?
You raise genetically modified crops and things. How much do you think that's affecting insect populations?
Not much at all. So there's a lot of different types of genetically modified crops, and I'm not pro-GM, I'm not anti. I just say, as a scientist, we should have the same rigour in looking at them as we do with insecticides, but we in fact apply even more rigour, like 100 times more rigour in looking at them. That's a topic for another day. But there'd be some of them that I would think one would want to consider. And the ones I'd want to consider are the ones that are producing an insecticide within them, which is absolutely harmless to humans. It's Bt protein and it's been tested to death. And it's only going to kill the insects that are actually eating the plant, the crop plant, as opposed to the spraying of everything. So it's quite targeted. So I think there is some value in Bt. A friend of mine at Melbourne University might actually win a Nobel Prize for another control strategy, which is using so-called endosymbiotic bacteria, bacteria that live inside insects. And they can do a number of different things, one of which is certain strains of these bacteria, they can produce female infertility. Now you can introduce these bacteria found in about 30% of all insect species on planet Earth, and different strains of these bacteria do something different. Some do nothing at all, but you can introduce them into a pest species and they can spread. And so he's introducing a bacterium called Wolbachia into insects that vector dengue fever, and is causing the populations of that mosquito to contract in urban areas in different parts of the world, and the rates of dengue fever are dropping dramatically. I think that that's a more natural solution because clearly the bacteria is out there in so many species, and introducing that into pests would be useful because of the 5.5 million species of insects on Earth, very few of them are pests, and so you just focus on the pests. So that would be my solution, the best one I can think of at the moment. But thanks for the question.
I think we've got time for one more question. Annie?
I'll bring the academic tone down a little bit. Backyard now, but literally for my backyard, this season I've seen cabbage moths everywhere.
Yep.
So I have been planting sacrificial nasturtiums to try and get them to eat that instead of all my other veggies, but they still like the veggies. So that I can go back, so I feel like I'm having a bit of a war with them at the moment, to how can I have any respect for them within the ecological system? Do I let them just go for the veggies, or are they a pest that I should still get out and take them?
Oh. Can I say pass? No.
Moral dilemma.
So, you know, that's an interesting case. The little white butterflies, we're all seeing them. And it testifies to something that I said earlier about temperature, but also humidity. So we've had a much more humid summer, and it's been consistently warm. And that's just been just the best of breeding conditions for those. So the one thing I'd say to you is it's probably not going to be true next year, because we're in the middle of, La Nina, and they're periodical. So I don't think it's a thing you're going to have to worry about long term. But it does emphasise, I talked about temperature, but humidity is absolutely vital. Switching insects to head lice, which you mentioned something like that and everybody just gets, including me, just gets a bit itchy. But one of the solutions, a friend of mine I did some research on a head lice cure, which is very effective, but it's never been commercialised. But the friend also told me that if you apply an old-fashioned hairdryer like my grandmother used to use, she'd put this thing on her head and had a tube that blew air into it, and it would just inflate like a big cake on the top of her head. Well, that creates a drying environment. And most insects do not cope with dehydration. So humidity and temperature are really important. I suspect that if you do nothing, summer's ending, the problem will go away, and these ethical questions of do I bring in the bazookas or not, I'm just going to stay out of for the moment.
Thank you so much, Phil, for generously sharing all of your research stories, and I think Phil will be able to answer some more questions over morning tea, but please join me.
I'd like to thank you. It's just a privilege to speak to people. You've all come out this morning and I really appreciate it. I'm going to mask up, but don't let that stop you talking to me. I go to lots of places and meet lots of people, and I'm a little bit vulnerable, so I'm going to put a mask on, but please come and chat.
Thanks, Phil, once again.
Now, I don't know how Phil manages to put that much content into that short a period of time, but we are really thankful for that. Before you go, yes, there is morning tea. We would love for you to just hang around and chat to Phil or Chris. But I do want to flag what next month's public lecture is about. We're changing it up a little bit. It will be quite story-based. The video will explain it, but just as a slight backstory, this friend of ours, Jodie, for 15 years, and the story she has, the impact she had in a community of people who were really looking for change is extraordinary. I would encourage you to come along. It will be the 4th Sunday of March, which happens to be the 27th again, but this will give you a little bit of a backstory for it, a little bit of a promotion. I'll just finish off and then it'll be morning teas time, so enjoy this. Jodie, we are thrilled to have you joining us for one of our Green Wedge Public Lectures. Tell us a little bit about yourself before we ask what you're going to be speaking on.
Yeah, sure. So me and my family, I've got 3 girls and a husband, and we have been living in Bangkok in a slum community, which we would call an informal settlement. We spent 14 years living there, and yeah.
Good. Now I can only try and get my head around what that experience would have been like for you.
Yeah.
It obviously taught you an awful lot. What will you be speaking to us about in our public lecture that's related to that?
Yeah.
But obviously the topic is fast fashion.
Yep.
Unpack that a little bit for us.
After a couple of years living in Bangkok, we recognised one of the major issues for our neighbours was employment. So we actually started with some neighbours a social enterprise to help create employment, and part of that, which we'll talk about when I come, was actually addressing some of the issues of fast fashion and just the excess and the way we consume, the way we are so willing to get rid of clothes, and just the impact that's having on the environment and on the poor. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a bit about, I'm going to share some stories of our time in Bangkok, of some of the women that I worked with, I'll also be, talking about some of the reality of fast fashion and how that's impacting the planet and the people. And also, like, because it can be a bit overwhelming, actually, the whole issue. It feels like it feels so far away too, and those impacts, yet our choices actually can make a difference. So I'm going to be talking a bit about what we can do as consumers and how we can make choices that make a difference.
Great.
Yeah.
So sometimes we feel, and we were talking about this before the video went on, about how paralysing it can feel. Yeah. You can't make any decision because you're just not sure, is this a good decision or a bad decision? So you being able to unpack real life stories and then able to give us some very practical tips on how to move forward. We are so excited for that and so looking forward to having you. So thanks, Jodie.
Thanks.
We'll see you on the 27th.
Be great.